Greetings everyone, ZeroAnnihilated here, and welcome to Depth Perception. My initial idea was to engage in a ZeroAnnihilated's AMA type video series, but when I was presented with this question, I was compelled to address it in a more in-depth response. The question comes from EternalDahaka, and I'd like to read it off here so everyone can be on the same page when I begin my response. Dahaka asks, what is your opinion on the term depth in relation to games? Specifically, when Budokai and Tenkaichi are compared, depth can mean different things depending on the preference of the player. Commonly, depth on the Budokai side of things relates to how different the characters are from each other, while posts about Tenkaichi many times focus on core mechanics, as in what you can do. While Tenkaichi may offer many more ways to defend, attack, and move, traditional fighters like Street Fighter are considered to have drastically more depth because of moveset variety, despite being more limited in what you can do. These are some examples, so you can give your definition of depth to any game. Now, I would first like to address this concept of depth being a relative term. Though the word itself has been clearly defined, the general gaming population has yet to reach a universal comprehension. Most fighting games include many differences in style, mechanics, roster, stages, etc., and I believe that many of these differences have caused a variation of beliefs in how the term depth is defined with their respective games. I don't want to scoff at the idea of depth being a relative term because I do understand the impulse. It would only make sense that as games include so many variations of gaming aspects, the term depth would have to be adaptive. This, again, I believe is due to the fact that combatants have been so far behind the evolutionary pace of how depth should be viewed, no one is able to properly evaluate a game based on comparative values. I will get into this more as the video continues. Now, I would also like to explore a bit on this failure to keep up with the evolution of depth understanding. As stated in the Depth series, the term depth is not bound by offensive detail. It expands to what options are available to the player during the flow of combat regarding offense, defense, and movement. The current fight game community's view on depth seems bound by offensive detail, and through the ignorance of the masses, has held its place in the spotlight. For the purpose of entertainment, I can't say I mind. But, when the traditional player bares his teeth and barks up an argument of depth comparison, I'm looking at a primate. It is a viewpoint of a professor hearing a child tell him 2 + 2 is 5. Sure, you can always tell the child that the answer is 4, but the evolution of depth understanding is a bit more complicated to explain. Sometimes you have to be fast enough to recognize the Pyrrhic victory. I've created the Depth series. It is up to everyone else to catch up. The only way I could accept the term depth as being relative would be to also consider it as conditional to the evaluation of a single fight game style, not to be used for comparative purposes unless both games meet the same conditions. For example, a two-dimensional game will have options regarding combat on the two-dimensional plane. Any comparison of depth would have to be bound by the two-dimensional plane to be relatively compared. Any comparison to a three-dimensional plane would introduce an unfamiliar concept, and the idea of relativity would no longer apply without the introduction of preference. I'll expand on this in a moment. If one were to consider the term depth as definitive, it is simply a matter of knowing the number of viable options a player may have access to during a match, reflecting offense, defense, and movement. Regardless, the level of depth should not, or at least may not, reflect the value of the game itself. Depth is not the only factor worthy of consideration when pertaining to gameplay value, because gameplay value relates to preference. I'm still able to enjoy games that others may find lacking, comparatively speaking. To this effect, whether one chooses to value a game's worth on depth or not, I believe traditional fighters are everything they were supposed to be and more. I believe Budokai was everything it was supposed to be and more. To be clear, depth, if you ask me, is a definitive term. The only questions left to ask in relation to this topic would be as follows. Does the game fulfill its potential? Does it meet expectations? This is a very difficult question to answer, for some games hold a depth that extends beyond initial expectation, Tenkaichi 2 and Super Smash Bros. Melee being two that come to mind. What does depth really matter if the game offers everything you expected it to, and more? Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was released in 1998. There have been several Zelda games released since then, along with many other adventure games built upon newer, more advanced systems that allow the game to be taken much further in terms of what the character can do during gameplay. And while the depth of newer games may expand beyond the capability of the Nintendo 64, Ocarina of Time still holds a 5 out of 5 from Metacritics, a perfect 10 with IGN and GameSpot, and I personally believe it to be one of the best adventure games I've ever played. Now, your words regarding character variation do not escape my attention. It is, in fact, character variation in Tenkaichi 2 that places emphasis on options available to one character that may prove lacking in another, given the character chosen with respect to his opponent. One of the biggest issues that hinders the traditional player's ability to recognize character differences in Tenkaichi stems from the inability to look past similarities. Such similarities are not so prominent at face value in most fighting games, so I acknowledge the impulse to categorize, but even identical twins can be very different in terms of depth and character. To further explain, we could examine a boxing game and recognize that all characters have the jab, the cross, the hook, and the uppercut. Does this support the argument that Muhammad Ali is to be used in the same fashion as Mike Tyson? Each character will have his or her own limitations with respect to the choice of his opponent, but this concept must also hold respect to the core mechanics of the game. The core mechanics of Tenkaichi expand well beyond the traditional fighter, and reflectively, so too do the options available to the character of choice. When you say, and I quote directly here, traditional fighters like Street Fighter are considered to have drastically more depth because of moveset variety, despite being more limited in what you can do. As per the very definition of depth, this statement translates as, traditional fighters like Street Fighter are considered to have drastically more depth because of moveset variety, despite not having as much depth. And I believe this is where the confusion sets in. There is absolutely nothing wrong with variety in character style. I welcome this. Variety is beautiful, but does not always produce depth. 4 options for one character differing from the 4 options of another character does not negate the fact that both characters still only have 4 options. The number of options for one character's style may or may not surpass the number of options for another, but while character variation may at times provide additional options to specific characters or expand on character depth via character favoritism, this very concept contradicts the traditional player's argument regarding the desired balanced combat system, and yet this would merely exhibit the depth of a handful or even a single character, leaving the rest of the game in a valued depth of neutrality. When calculating any specific character's depth based on a game that emphasizes character variety, one would still be required to provide detail founded on the mechanics of the game itself. So once again, it all boils down to the core mechanics of the game, as in what you can do. Discussing the overpowered attributes that expand upon the depth of a single character does not explain the depth of the game. It explains the depth of the character. And for what it's worth, I absolutely see the value in it. But when explaining the depth of the game's entirety, character variation may actually nerf the intended impact. That being said, keep in mind that in Dragon Ball Z games, a character may possess the ability to transform into another form of character, providing all new techniques in the same battle. As transforming proves itself a viable option in many battles, it may act as a transitional option to provide new viable options. there aren't many fighting games that come to mind in which an aspect of depth can actually create more depth during a battle. Now, I don't expect everyone to agree with my viewpoint, but I'm sure you'll acknowledge my words as worthy of consideration. This is ZeroAnnihilated, and this is my depth perception.